Welcome to the Loresworn War College for Hearts of Iron 4. You're watching our course on division design, and this is lesson 205, Motorized and Mechanized Divisions. In Hearts of Iron 4, the main advantage of motorized and mechanized infantry is mobility. They can't keep up with tanks in terms of armor and hardness, but they're as fast or faster than most tank models, and they don't have the drawbacks of tanks in low organization and recovery rate. To the point that, as you saw if you watched our last video, it's almost always advisable to mix some in with your tank units. For the sake of comparison, we're going to take this medium tank company, very similar to the one we built in the last video, and replace it with just mechanized infantry to see what the difference in stats actually is. And this should give you some sort of an idea of what the role of mechanized and motorized infantry is in comparison to a tank division. Now, predictably, HP and organization goes way up, since infantry are your main sources of these two stats, and tanks barely have any at all. They also use less weight and less supply, which makes them more capable of operating in harsh conditions and behind enemy lines. Defense also goes up significantly, meaning it's much better to use mechanized or motorized infantry to hold a line than it is to use tanks in most cases. They lose a lot of breakthrough though, so they're definitely not as good on the offensive, and they have far less armor, piercing, and soft and hard attack. There's also a noticeable difference in production cost. As you can see, with all other things being equal, I can produce 1.82 mechanized equipment a month versus only 1.4 medium tanks, and a whopping 1.68 motorized per week. So motorized equipment is going to be much easier to come by than either of the other two. In general, the key word with mechanized and motorized infantry is mobility. You can get motorized infantry from France to Poland a lot faster than you could leg infantry, and mechanized also fight harder and are great for pushing up behind tanks that have created a breakthrough or an encirclement. They can also be used in a double role to hold a line, since their defense, HP, and organization stats are pretty decent compared to tanks, and a small core of motorized or mechanized can be held in reserve to quickly reinforce an area of the battlefield where it's needed, allowing you to defend a much larger area with much fewer units. Let's start out with building a standard motorized infantry division. As we demonstrated in an earlier video, motorized have basically the same combat stats as leg infantry, but are 3 times as fast, which can make a huge difference, especially if you're fighting in a large open area, like, say, the continental United States. They gain a small amount of hardness, but barely enough to make a difference. And on the downside, they have significant attack and movement penalties in certain types of terrain. Now, we can reduce this penalty a bit by giving them the engineer company, which frankly I attach to just about everything if you haven't realized by this point in the series. And same goes for recon. Since this is already a motorized unit, there's really no penalty in adding motorized support companies to it, since you're going to be producing motorized equipment in large numbers anyway if you've committed to this type of division. So I would definitely go ahead and add my go-to field hospital to this one as well. Support artillery also remains a go-to of mine on pretty much all of my infantry divisions, and motorized are no exception. The final slot, as usual, is fairly situational. You could go with the signal company for the added initiative, since these guys are all about getting to the front as quickly as possible. Anti-tank, if you think you're going to need some extra hard attack, or a maintenance company if perhaps your industry isn't quite up to snuff to be producing a lot of motorized and you need to preserve the ones you have. For this division, I'm going to go ahead and go with the support anti-tank, just because I want it to be well-rounded and usable in as many scenarios as possible. Having a good, flexible motorized infantry unit like this on hand can go a long way, and in the later stages of the war, I tend to replace a lot of my leg infantry with motorized and mechanized. Now let's swap these out for mechanized just to see how that changes the stats. These are the early 1941 mechanized infantry battalions, so keep in mind that depending where you are in the tech tree, stats can change significantly, particularly in terms of speed, considering the highest level mechanized infantry actually have the same speed as a motorized unit. Our HP goes up by a fairly significant amount, but so does our weight and supply use. We gain a decent amount of soft attack, a lot of hard attack, a huge amount of defense and breakthrough, as well as a small amount of armor and piercing. Our hardness has also gone up from 10% to 60%, which is a massive difference. Mechanized infantry are straight up better at fighting, not just more mobile than leg infantry, and fill a role somewhere between an infantry unit and a tank unit. Now, since mechanized costs so much more production than motorized, almost as much as a medium tank, I would definitely swap out one of these support companies for a maintenance company in a mechanized division. As we showed off in the last video, a mechanized company starts with a speed of 8 kilometers per hour, but then upgrades to 10 kilometers an hour and 12 kilometers an hour at the final stage in 1945, which is the same speed as a motorized company. You might ask yourself if it's worth it at this point to replace all of your motorized with mechanized, and personally, I think if you have the production to do it, it's worthwhile. Just keep in mind that you'll still need to produce motorized equipment for the support companies that require them. You can't swap in mechanized for these three. Also often overlooked, you can create a variant of motorized equipment. In the US's case, it's the T-27 xylophone that unlocks motorized rocket artillery. This allows you to basically attach line artillery, full-on battalions, to your motorized divisions without slowing them down, and opens up some pretty cool avenues of blitzing the enemy line with high soft attack units and routing them quickly. Since this is a little bit of a shorter video, we'll talk a little bit about cavalry too. Even though they aren't necessarily motorized, they do fall into the broad category of mobile battalions. I don't particularly like cavalry, and I don't use them much. As a matter of fact, nations that start with a lot of cavalry, I usually swap it out for regular infantry as fast as possible. But there is one advantage they have over normal infantry, and we'll create a normal infantry battalion, 10 wide, to demonstrate the difference. Now, if we replace all of our leg infantry with cavalry, as I've shown before, the stats don't change much. We get a small increase in speed and organization, and lose a small amount of defense and breakthrough. However, our suppression goes up by 10, and this is really the main use of cavalry in Hearts of Iron 4. They're better at suppressing partisans in occupied territory than any other comparably priced unit type. This also makes them ideal for attaching the one type of support company we haven't talked about at all because it's fairly useless on frontline combat units, the military police. They actually give you a fairly decent increase in combat stats, all things considered, but their main role is to increase your suppression by a fairly significant amount. And this allows you to have small units of cavalry just riding around dealing with rebels without having to really tax your resources or create a dedicated infantry unit to do this role. In the case of this kind of anti-suppression unit, I wouldn't encourage building it any larger than 10 wide, and also wouldn't bother attaching any other support units to it, since ideally these guys shouldn't even be fighting, and you want them to require as little equipment as possible so you can build lots of them to fill in all those little spaces where people are getting uppity due to your conquests. And that's about all you need to know to build a good mechanized or motorized infantry division. If you found any part of this confusing, definitely go back and look at our videos on what all the stats mean and on what each individual battalion brings to the field. Up next, we'll be wrapping up this series of courses with a video on specialized divisions, including special forces.